organization advocates from a Christian worldview, but was labeled a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center for taking stances that align with simply biblical teaching. So I want to ask you a few questions, Mr. Perkins. Is the Christian worldview hateful?
No.
Is affirming that there are only two genders hateful?
No.
Is believing God created marriage between a man and a woman hateful?
No, it's the reason we're all here today.
Is the Christian worldview that teaches the very morals upon which this nation was founded hateful?
No, sir.
And does disapproving of someone's actions mean that you hate them?
No. The definition that the SPLC holds out is one that's trying to prevent violence. Words are not violent when you're having...
You just watched the most insidious piece of political theater, masquerading as principled discourse, a carefully choreographed performance where a Republican lawmaker parades a Christian nationalist witness through a script designed to launder hate speech as religious liberty. And if your stomach isn't churning with recognition at the audacity of this strategy, then you haven't been paying attention to the metastatic crisis of Christian nationalism consuming American democracy in real time. This is what authoritarian transformation looks like when it wears a cross and wraps itself in the Constitution, when it demands you respect its divine right to legislate your body out of existence, your marriage into illegality, your very identity into erasure, and then insists with wounded innocence that pointing out this genocidal impulse somehow constitutes the real violence here, because apparently words criticizing their crusade to strip you of civil rights are more harmful than the actual policies that render queer and trans people homeless, unemployable, vulnerable to state-sanctioned discrimination and vigilante violence at rates that should make every single American ashamed. Let me be crystal clear about what you witnessed, because the framing matters desperately, and the corporate media will inevitably both sides this fascist pageantry into meaningless noise, treating it as just another round in the culture war, rather than what it actually represents, which is the systematic deployment of religious rhetoric to justify the legislative erasure of LGBTQ+ people from public life. Focus on the Family was recently added to the Southern Poverty Law Center's hate group designation for its stances against LGBTQ+ lifestyles and its biblical worldview strategy that opposes same-sex marriage and affirms biological sexual identity. And understand that this designation isn't arbitrary pearl-clutching from coastal elites, but rather a careful documentation of decades of harm perpetuated by organizations that claim biblical authority for their campaigns to deny fundamental human dignity to queer people. The witness in this hearing stands as a representative of this apparatus, the institutional machinery of Christian nationalism that has spent 50 years building power through precisely this kind of rhetorical sleight of hand, where discrimination gets rebranded as religious freedom and systemic violence against vulnerable communities gets laundered through appeals to ancient texts. Now here's where this gets absolutely chilling, and I need you to understand the stakes with perfect clarity because we are living through the implementation phase of a blueprint that was decades in the making. On the first day of Trump's term, Executive Order 1468 was released, officially recognizing only two genders, male and female, which represent more than 75% of proposed policies in Project 2025 pertaining to the limitation of LGBTQ+ freedoms that have been implemented by the Trump administration. This isn't coincidence. This is Christian nationalism wielding federal power to impose theological doctrine as public policy. Russell Vought, who literally wrote a column titled, "Is there anything actually wrong with Christian nationalism?" answering no, is the architect behind Project 2025, which relies upon a biblical interpretation of marriage and family as strictly heterosexual, attacks the very existence of trans people as against God's order, and describes support for LGBTQ+ rights as pornography. When you hear that witness calmly denying that affirming only two genders is hateful, when you hear him insist that opposing same-sex marriage doesn't constitute discrimination, you are hearing the sanitized public relations version of an ideological movement that has captured significant portions of the Republican Party and is currently using every lever of governmental power to reshape American society according to a theocratic vision that treats pluralism itself as an existential threat. The violence here isn't subtle if you're willing to look at it honestly, and I mean really look at the consequences rather than getting distracted by the decorum of congressional hearings and the polite tone deployed by people advocating for your legal marginalization. Between May 2024 and May 2025, GLAAD's Alert Desk tracked 932 anti-LGBTQ incidents in 49 U.S. states and the District of Columbia, the equivalent of 2.5 incidents every day, and incidents against trans people increased by 14%, with at least 26 injuries and 1 death motivated by anti-trans hate specifically. Let me translate what these numbers mean in human terms, because statistics can numb us to the lived reality of terror. These are people being assaulted for existing, people losing jobs, people being driven from their communities, young people contemplating or attempting suicide because the society around them has been taught through exactly this kind of rhetoric that their existence is illegitimate, unnatural, against God's design. LGBT people experienced 106.4 violent victimizations per 1,000 persons, compared with 21.1 per 1,000 among non-LGBT persons, and experienced a higher rate of serious violence including rape, sexual assault, robbery, or aggravated assault. These bodies, these lives, these communities bearing the physical manifestation of ideological violence that begins in spaces exactly like congressional hearings where respectable men in suits deny that their positions constitute hatred. And the witness has the absolute gall to stand there and proclaim that words are not violent while advocating for positions that demonstrably lead to violence, that create the permission structure for violence, that tell millions of Americans that queer and trans people are aberrations to be legislated away, rather than citizens deserving equal protection under law. This is the core dishonesty of the Christian nationalist project. This studied refusal to acknowledge the chain of causation between rhetoric and material harm, between theological claims and discriminatory policy, between declaring someone's identity illegitimate and the violence that inevitably flows toward delegitimized populations. Research found that following Trump campaign rallies in 2016 containing hate rhetoric, there was an increase in hate-motivated incidents in the counties where rallies happened, and after the 2016 election, transgender and gender non-conforming people reported experiences of hate speech and violence, with attacks on transgender care leading to increased harassment, including death threats against hospitals and doctors. This is the documented reality, the empirical evidence that rhetoric claiming certain identities are unnatural or sinful creates environments where violence against those populations increases, and yet we're supposed to sit here and nod respectfully while a Christian nationalist operative claims his organization's decades-long campaign against LGBTQ+ rights bears no responsibility for this climate of terror. The Southern Poverty Law Center's designation matters precisely because it names this reality, because it refuses the comfortable fiction that you can spend decades demonizing a vulnerable population and then wash your hands of the consequences when that population experiences epidemic levels of violence. The SPLC stated that organizations like Focus on the Family attempt to encode anti-LGBTQ+ ideology into American life and law while strategically crafting a public image as family counselors and perpetuate decades-old tropes about gay people that divide families, churches, and communities. This is strategic. This is calculated. This is the deliberate deployment of respectability politics to advance positions that when implemented cause measurable harm to real people. And the genius of the strategy, if we can call something this morally bankrupt genius, lies in claiming persecution, when these harms get documented and named, in framing accountability as the real violence rather than the policies that strip people of healthcare access, employment protections, housing security, and legal recognition of their families. Now let's talk about what this hearing represents in the larger architecture of Christian nationalist power, because this isn't an isolated incident, but rather one piece of a comprehensive strategy to normalize discrimination as religious conviction. FBI Director Kash Patel announced the Bureau was severing all ties with the SPLC, calling it a partisan smear machine, which means the federal government under Trump is actively working to delegitimize the very organizations that document hate group activity and track the Christian nationalist movement's encroachment on democratic institutions. Figures like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert have talked about how Christian nationalism informs their understanding of politics and identify explicitly as Christian nationalists. And we are at a point in American politics where Christian nationalism is something that many people are discussing. This isn't fringe anymore. This isn't the paranoid fantasies of culture war casualties. This is explicit theocratic ideology, operating openly in the halls of Congress, with the full backing of a captured party apparatus that sees Christian nationalism as its base, rather than a dangerous extremist element to be contained. The hearing you just watched is Christian nationalism doing what it does best, which is claiming the mantle of victimhood while wielding institutional power to victimize others, insisting it faces persecution while actively legislating to persecute, demanding religious liberty while denying the liberty of anyone whose existence contradicts its theological commitments. The extreme right wing of the Republican Party has been openly besotted with Viktor Orban's autocratic rule, his takeover of Hungarian government institutions, and especially his patriarchal Christian nationalism, which embraces traditional gender roles and marriage while demonizing LGBTQ+ individuals. And Christian nationalists believe the Christian Bible should be the basis of government, with a patriarchal view that does not recognize gender equality or gay rights and sanctions discrimination based on religious beliefs. This is the model. This is what they're building toward. An America where one narrow interpretation of Christianity gets encoded into law and enforced through state power, where pluralism becomes impossible because the state privileges Christian belief over all other forms of religious and secular conscience, where your right to exist depends entirely on whether your existence can be reconciled with someone else's reading of ancient scripture. And Democrats sitting silent as this performance unfolds represents another kind of moral catastrophe, because silence in the face of eliminationist rhetoric is complicity. Silence when fascism puts on a suit and speaks in calm tones about biblical principles is how democracies die by degrees rather than dramatic coups. Where is the thundering denunciation? Where is the moral clarity to say unequivocally that no religious tradition gets to impose its theological anthropology on the rest of us, through law? Where is the willingness to call this what it actually is, rather than treating it like a legitimate difference of opinion about policy minutiae? Christian nationalism is the single biggest threat to religious freedom in the United States today, antithetical to the constitutional ideal that belonging in American society is not predicated on what faith one practices, or whether someone is religious at all, and the political ideology that seeks to merge American and Christian identities is deeply embedded in American society. This requires opposition commensurate with the threat. This requires Democrats to abandon the fantasy that we can civilly debate with people whose entire project is predicated on your non-existence. This requires recognizing that we are not in a normal political disagreement, but rather an existential struggle over whether America will be a democracy that protects all its citizens, or a theocracy that privileges one tradition's adherents, while legally marginalizing everyone else. The strategic deployment of the SPLC as villain in this narrative is particularly insidious, because it attempts to discredit the very organizations doing the vital work of documenting hate group activity and tracking extremist movements. U.S. Representative James Comer launched an investigation into the SPLC's federal influence and the alleged weaponizing of its hate list to target conservatives. The Family Research Council has drafted a petition calling on the Department of Justice to immediately sever all ties with the Southern Poverty Law Center and formally renounce its influence on federal law enforcement and public policy decisions. This is how authoritarianism consolidates power, by attacking the watchdog organizations, by delegitimizing the institutions that provide early warning systems about democratic backsliding, by creating an information environment where calling out hate becomes more controversial than perpetuating it. And the consequence is that we lose our ability to collectively name and resist the creep of extremism because the vocabulary itself gets contested, because organizations that say this group spreads harmful rhetoric about LGBTQ+ people get accused of the real intolerance while the groups spreading that rhetoric claim martyrdom. Let me be absolutely explicit about what affirming that there are only two genders means in practice when encoded into law and policy, because this isn't abstract theology but concrete governance with devastating consequences. Declaring that sex is a fixed biological fact erases legal recognition of gender identity as a valid and protected status, targets the trans and non-binary community, and opens the door for widespread discrimination for those who do not easily fit into the gender binary. Trump's executive order required the federal government to recognize only two immutable sexes, and a lawsuit filed by an NSA employee argues this declares that it is the policy of the United States government to deny Ms. O'Neill's very existence, with the NSA subsequently canceling its policy recognizing her transgender identity, prohibiting her from identifying her pronouns as female, and barring her from using the women's restroom at work. This is the material reality of simply biblical teaching when implemented through state power. People losing workplace protections, people unable to access appropriate facilities, people whose identity documents don't match their lived reality, thereby exposing them to harassment and discrimination at every turn. This is violence. This is harm. This is the state participating in the erasure of a class of citizens, and the witness claiming this isn't hateful is engaging in either breathtaking self-deception or calculated mendacity. The broader context here is that we are living through the most sustained assault on LGBTQ+ rights in modern American history, an assault coordinated across multiple levels of government and civil society, backed by enormous resources from Christian nationalist organizations, and now wielding the full power of the executive branch to implement a theocratic vision of American society, the number of bills seeking to prohibit gender-affirming care has surged in recent years, with many seeking to outlaw care for minors and adults and impact insurance coverage or access to services, and 575 anti-LGBTQ bills were introduced in state legislatures in 2025, and though 92% were defeated, the damage is done when they are introduced and talked about in local media. Each of these bills, even the ones that fail, contributes to a climate where LGBTQ+ people are perpetually under siege, where their rights are always provisional and subject to legislative whim, where they cannot simply exist but must constantly defend their existence against bad faith attacks wrapped in religious language. And each hearing like this one, each performance where Christian nationalists get to rehearse their talking points unchallenged, each moment where Democrats fail to mount vigorous opposition, moves the Overton window further toward accepting discrimination as legitimate religious exercise. This brings us to the fundamental question that should animate every progressive's response to this spectacle, which is whether we will allow religious belief to function as an all-purpose exemption from civil rights law, whether we will permit theology to trump equal protection, whether we will accept that sincere religious conviction justifies discrimination against classes of citizens. The Christian nationalist position is unambiguous. Their interpretation of biblical teaching should be legally protected even when it requires denying others their civil rights. Their religious liberty includes the liberty to discriminate, and any attempt to hold them accountable for the harms this causes constitutes persecution of Christians. This is authoritarianism dressed in vestments. This is theocracy with better public relations, and it cannot be accommodated or compromised with, because the logic inexorably leads to Christian supremacy encoded in law with all the violence that entails for religious minorities, the non-religious, and anyone whose identity contradicts Christian nationalist theology. The witness's performance is particularly galling in its studied moderation, in the calm, reasonable tone deployed to advocate for positions that when implemented will cause immense suffering. The SPLC stated that groups like James Kennedy Ministries malign the entire LGBT community, portraying it as perverted and a threat to the nation, and that the fact that Coral Ridge claims its statements about the LGBT community are biblically based doesn't immunize it from criticism. This is the key point that must be hammered home relentlessly. Claiming religious motivation does not exempt you from criticism. When your religiously motivated actions cause harm, biblical justification does not launder discrimination into something acceptable, and sincerely held religious belief does not trump other people's civil rights. We fought this battle over segregation. We fought it over interracial marriage. We fought it over women's equality. And each time the religious arguments for hierarchy and discrimination were eventually defeated, not because they weren't sincerely held, but because sincere belief does not justify treating human beings as less than fully human under law. Now let's discuss the specific rhetorical strategies deployed here, because understanding how Christian nationalism operates linguistically is essential to countering it effectively. Notice how the questions are structured to elicit simple no answers, creating a rhythmic litany that normalizes the positions being articulated. Is the Christian worldview hateful? No. Is affirming that there are only two genders hateful? No. Is believing God created marriage between a man and a woman hateful? No. This is catechism, masquerading as congressional testimony. This is liturgical repetition designed to make these positions seem self-evident rather than contested theological claims being imposed through political power. The genius of the framing lies in how it collapses the distinction between holding a belief and legally imposing that belief on others who don't share it. Nobody is arguing that Christians can't personally believe in a gender binary or opposite-sex marriage. The argument is that you don't get to encode your theological anthropology into civil law that governs everyone, including those who reject your theology, but by framing any criticism of their policy agenda as an attack on Christian belief itself, they claim persecution while perpetuating it. The claim that words are not violent deserves particular scrutiny because it represents a profound bad faith about how social reality and state violence operate. Words absolutely can be violent when they create the ideological conditions for physical violence, when they construct categories of legitimate and illegitimate humanity, when they provide the justification for stripping people of legal protections. Politicians who spread disinformation and demonize LGBTQ+ lives are contributing to violence, with anti-LGBTQ+ bias now motivating more than 1 in 5 of any type of hate crime. The rhetoric that trans people are confused, that same-sex relationships are sinful aberrations, that gender non-conforming people represent an attack on God's design, This rhetoric does profound violence by teaching society that these populations are less deserving of protection, less entitled to dignity, more appropriate targets for discrimination and abuse. And when organizations like Focus on the Family spend decades and millions of dollars disseminating this rhetoric, when they work tirelessly to prevent anti-discrimination protections and push conversion therapy and oppose every single advance toward legal equality, they bear moral responsibility for the climate of fear and violence they help create. Claiming that their advocacy causes no harm because they're not personally throwing punches is the moral reasoning of cowards who want the fruits of their ideological labor without accountability for the harvest. The historical parallel to segregationist Christianity is inescapable and should be invoked relentlessly because we have been here before. We have watched religious conviction deployed to justify legal discrimination. We have seen how biblical principles get mobilized to maintain hierarchies of power and privilege. White evangelical Christianity provided the theological justification for slavery and then segregation, claiming that God ordained racial separation and that miscegenation violated divine law. Those positions were held sincerely, they were rooted in biblical interpretation, and they were deployed through the same machinery of churches and parachurch organizations to influence policy and maintain white supremacy. We do not now say, well, they believed it sincerely, so criticism was unfair. We say they were wrong. Their theology was poisonous, and their religious conviction did not make discrimination acceptable. The same logic applies here. Christian nationalism's positions on gender and sexuality will be regarded by history with the same revulsion we now reserve for Christian defenses of segregation, and the organizations promoting these positions will be remembered not as faithful witnesses to biblical truth, but as agents of harm who valued theological purity over human dignity. The larger stakes here extend far beyond LGBTQ+ rights, though those stakes are already existential for the communities under attack. Project 2025's stated goal is to create an ideal America that would see women, LGBTQ+ people, immigrants, people of color, and others deprived of their hard-won constitutional rights, with the erosion of environmental and education protections and reduced economic opportunities for all, particularly marginalized communities. This is comprehensive authoritarian transformation, using Christianity as both justification and vehicle. This is the replacement of pluralistic democracy with theocratic autocracy. This is the systematic dismantling of the post-New Deal administrative state and the civil rights gains of the past 70 years in service of a vision where Christian men hold authority over everyone else, and dissent from Christian nationalist orthodoxy becomes increasingly impossible. The hearing you witnessed is one small piece of this much larger project, one performance in an extended campaign to normalize Christian supremacy as the natural order rather than a profound violation of America's founding commitments to religious freedom and equal protection. And the silence from Democrats matters desperately because fascism advances not just through the audacity of its proponents, but through the cowardice of its opponents, not just through the Republicans who embrace Christian nationalism, but through the Democrats who won't name it clearly and oppose it vigorously. Every moment spent treating this as normal political discourse, rather than existential threat. Every instance of both sidesing between people fighting for civil rights and people fighting to deny them. Every failure to articulate clearly that Christian nationalism is incompatible with constitutional democracy. All of this enables the creep of authoritarianism by making it seem like one legitimate option among many, rather than a civilizational emergency requiring total opposition. We need Democrats to stop clutching pearls about civility and start fighting like democracy depends on it, because democracy does depend on it. We need progressives to stop worrying about offending Christians generally by criticizing Christian nationalism specifically. We need a politics of moral clarity that says unequivocally, your religious freedom ends where my civil rights begin, your theological convictions do not justify my legal marginalization, and we will resist every attempt to impose your narrow interpretation of Christianity through state power. This moment demands nothing less than complete commitment to pluralism, to the proposition that America's diversity is strength rather than threat, to the recognition that protecting vulnerable minorities from discrimination is not optional, but essential to legitimate governance. The Christian nationalism on display in this hearing represents the opposite of every value that should animate progressive politics. It demands hierarchy where we champion equality. It insists on conformity where we celebrate diversity. It deploys state power to marginalize where we use it to protect. It treats difference as threat where we treat it as gift. And the material consequences of Christian nationalism achieving its goals would be catastrophic not just for LGBTQ+ people, but for everyone who values freedom of conscience, religious liberty understood as freedom from religious imposition, and a society where your full citizenship doesn't depend on accepting someone else's theological framework. This is why we fight. This is why the stakes are existential. This is why every single hearing like this one demands vigorous opposition rather than polite engagement, because what's at stake is whether America will be a democracy that protects all its citizens or a theocracy that privileges Christians while legally marginalizing everyone else. The choice could not be more clear, and history will judge us by whether we rose to meet this moment with the moral seriousness it requires.